Okay, good evening. Welcome to Rogue Reads, a monthly author event hosted by the Rogue Women Writers, of which I am a proud member. Rogue Women Writers is a group of 10 thriller writers whose backgrounds range from intelligence officer to journalism to psychotherapist to White House strategist. I am TRACY CLARK, as I said, and I am the author of the Cass Rain's Chicago Mystery Series, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm happy to welcome tonight four prolific, internationally best-selling, infinitely interesting authors, SARA PARETSKY, Amanda Quick, James Rollins, and Chris Holm. And we're happy to have them. Welcome them. This is how it goes. I'm going to introduce all four of them, and then I'll double back and we will learn a little bit about their new releases. And then they'll read an excerpt from the books. So that's very exciting to do. All of the books that we're discussing tonight are available at your local bookstore, and we encourage you to seek them out. I don't think you'll be disappointed anyone you choose. For those joining us on Zoom, you'll be in the gallery during the readings, and we encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, please add a comment if you have anything you want the authors to know or have a question to ask. If the authors will be reading only briefly, so we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. And as a bonus, we have a giveaway. So each author has given us a signed copy of their new releases, and we'll select randomly for winners. So good luck to everyone. If you have opportunity to sort of post on social media, we would appreciate using the hashtags Rogue Reads or Rogue Women Writers. And that's about it for the house cleaning. So we'll get started without further ado. In no particular order, we'll start with SARA PARETSKY. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, glad to be here.
SARA PARETSKY is the author of 32 books, including 23 V.I. Warshawski novels. She was named 2011's Grand Master by the Mystery Writers of America, and is a winner of many awards, including the Cartier Diamond Dagger Award for Lifetime Achievement from the British Crime Writers Association, and the CWA's Gold Dagger. She's also the winner of the 2019 G.P. Putnam and Sons Sue Grafton Memorial Award. And that's about all you gave us in terms of bio, kind of light, actually. I would also add co-founder of Sisters in Crime, the premier crime writing association focused on equity and inclusion in the writing community and in publishing. The group started in 1986 with 26 women crime writers, and that has grown to now 4,500 members, sisters and misters, and more than 60 regional chapters worldwide. Awesome achievement.
Thank you.
Overboard is number 23 in the V.I. Warshawski series, and it released on May 10th, less than a week ago. Congratulations on the launch.
It's been great fun. Thank you.
One of my favorite parts about Rogue Reads is that we ask our guests to sort of give us their favorite snacks and drink combinations. It's always sort of fun to see where characters are and writers are. Sarah's favorite snack is toast with goat cheese and pears, which sounds really delicious, and I probably would have prepared it if I hadn't had to turn my oven on. I don't usually do that on a normal basis, but take my word for it. I think it looks delicious in terms of the recipe. It's on our website. Check it out. Sarah says the snack can be served with Sardinian vermentino from VI's mother's part of Italy, the Umbrian Hills, or Brunello, Sarah's current favorite Italian red. I sort of picked one here to sort of stand in for that. Of course, that VI's drink is Black Label whiskey, which you would expect. I mean, that's perfect PI drink right there for Chicago Badass PI. So that's wonderful. But she says that VI would likely go for the good red wine with the pears and the goat cheese. I think Overboard, I'm gonna ask you a question really off the top. It's probably the first new release that I've sort of seen that sort of tackles the COVID crisis. It's not a big part of the plot, but you sort of mentioned the lockdowns, the COVID precautions. I wondered sort of what decision sort of went into that, sort of you tackling it when so many other writers are sort of avoiding it.
You know, it's just excuse me, it's part of the context of how we're living today. I'm a very slow thinker. I'm a fast writer, but I'm a slow thinker. So it takes me a long time to think my way through a book. And during the 2 years I was working on Overboard and COVID was waxing and waning and waxing, I kept taking it out, putting it in. And then I thought, well, it's just part of the soup that we're swimming in these days. And also some of the ways that people are being really violent in public over issues like masking or not masking, they end up showing how characters' personality, how you're reacting to wearing a mask. You just take it and do it. Do you hate it but not talk about it? Do you become violent when someone asks you to do it? It's all part of how you can display a personality. So it became kind of just a part of the context of the story, but also an interesting way to look at characters.
Great. So we'll double back in a minute. We'll introduce our next author. That would be JAYNE KRENTZ, aka Amanda Quick, aka Jane Castle. 3 best-selling authors in one human body, which is awesome. Welcome, Jane or Amanda, or which do you prefer, Jane?
Jane is fine, yeah.
Jane, okay, good. Let's see. With more than 50 New York Times bestsellers and over 40 million books sold, JAYNE KRENTZ is one of the most successful commercial fiction writers writing today. She is lauded for her pulse-pounding romantic thrillers, unique spins on futuristic suspense, and witty historical romantic mysteries. Jane/Amanda lives in Seattle, Washington. Jane's favorite drink is red wine. Same. Her snack of choice, Orville Redenbacher popcorn. And the recipe is really simple, 2 steps. Put it in the microwave and then eat it, which is right up my alley. Let's see. Okay, which I sort of got the popcorn here, but I sort of labeled it the Scandal Special. If you remember the show, Olympia Pope sort of ended her Washington marauding at the end of the day with a bowl of popcorn and a glass of red wine. Perfect combination. Thanks for joining us, Jane.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. This is going to be fun.
When She Dreams, which is your new book, introduces the concept of lucid dreaming. What is that precisely?
The short version of the explanation is that lucid dreaming is dreaming and you know you're dreaming. And the goal is to be able to take control of the dream and rewrite the script. And it was hugely popular in the 1930s, which is when the book is set. And it's hugely popular today. You can go online and find lots of people who will claim to be able to teach you how to learn how to lucid dream.
Okay, good. We'll learn more about that when we come back to you. Hi, James. You're up next. Welcome. James Rollins is the #1 New York Times bestseller of international thrillers that have been translated into 40 languages. His Sigma series has been lauded as one of the top crowd pleasers for its exploration into unseen worlds, scientific breakthroughs, and historical secrets. He also introduced his first book in a new epic fantasy series back in January, The Starless Crown. He currently lives in the Sierra Nevada mountains with his golden retriever, Echo, and a new rescue dog, Charlie, of unknown genealogy. His new book, which we'll hear from tonight.
I'm fondling my crotch. It's actually the dog.
Is that his spot?
I should make that clear.
His new book is Kingdom of Bones, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. When James is working, his favorite drink is Rockstar energy drink. A lot of caffeine in that, James. Were you aware?
Yeah, there is.
Okay, good.
I limit myself to one per day.
When not working, it's whiskey, which is kind of, I don't know. Seems should be the other way around, but whatever. For snack, his current obsession, made twice a week, he says, is a clean version of granola. Again, the recipe is on our site, more than 2 steps, so I didn't try it. It sounds delicious. So glad to have you here, James.
Thank you very much.
You're a retired veterinarian, an amateur spelunker, and scuba diver. So writing wasn't challenging enough for you?
I figured I'd do something with my spare time. I began writing just as a hobby, and After a few books got sold, my clients became suspicious. Something's going on with this doctor. Mostly because I had, posters in the lobby, get your cat spayed, get a free book. They began to ask me, what's this writing business? And I thought, well, I'll try to answer that while I drain your dog's anal glands. But, for 15 years, veterinary medicine was my paycheck, and writing was a hobby. And I thought, down the line, it'd be nice to reverse that role and have veterinary medicine be my hobby and writing be my paycheck. And I sort of resent when people say former veterinarian, because I can still neuter a cat in under 30 seconds. I still work with a group that traps feral cats, wild cats. They bring them to the shelter. I spay and neuter them. So basically all I do with my veterinary degree, just remove genitalia, but it's a hobby. I think I've achieved my goal. So that's basically how I ended up here.
All right, cool. We'll double back. Next up, we've got Chris Holm. Chris is the author of the cross-genre collector trilogy, the Michael Hendricks thrillers, and the new scientific thriller Child Zero, which released just 4 days ago. Congrats, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Chris is also a former molecular biologist. Got some heavy hitters here tonight. With a U.S. patent to his name, Chris's work has been selected for the Best American Mystery Stories, named a New York Times Editor's Choice, and he has won a number of awards, including the 2016 Anthony Award for Best Novel. He lives in Portland, Maine. Jacob Gibson, his protagonist in his Child Zero book, lives in a post-antibiotic era, which is kind of frightening, where meat and dairy are luxury items. Just imagine that. So Chris reasons Jake's favorite indulgence would be a bacon cheeseburger. Sounds good. With a chocolate malt on the side. The best place for chocolate malts in my part of the woods is Portillo's. As you can see the cup here.
Oh, fantastic.
The malt's gone, long gone, but just great cheeseburgers. They're known for their hot dogs. Good spot to go to. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much. And I should note that just to balance out James, my cat Dashel has decided to make an appearance at our event. So both felines and canines represented here. He's shy. He's now leaving. He's embarrassed.
So Chris, what's your patent for? What did you get a patent?
Oh gosh. So about 3 lifetimes ago, I was working at a marine biotechnology company, and I discovered a gene in spiny lobsters that resulted in a patent that allows you to raise saltwater shellfish in fresh water. So it's exceedingly boring, and I promise my book is not nearly that boring.
Oh, it's not. I guarantee it's not. All right, so good. Welcome all 4 of you. I'm glad you're with us tonight. Just an honor to have you. We'll go back to Sarah, and we'll get a quick overview of Overboard, and then she'll read a little bit for us, which is going to be a great treat. So Sarah, what can you tell us about Overboard?
Well, first, I didn't know that we were supposed to say what we did in our past lives, but I have a very close connection to Chris in my past life because I washed glassware in a lab of a molecular biologist as my job outside babysitting outside the home. And I'm still a demon dishwasher, I have to say.
Right.
In high demand at all my friends' parties. Overboard, I wasn't going to call it my pandemic book until I saw Louisa Luna's most recent book. She referred to that as her pandemic book and apologized profusely for all of the missteps. I found Overboard the most difficult book that I have written. Probably this is my 40th year with publishing VI, and it's probably been 30 years since I had this much trouble telling a story and pulling the pieces together. So I went back to the beginning with many different iterations 7 times until I got to where I am now. So sometimes I'm confused about what is this book really about? But it starts with VI's dogs, who are usually much better behaved than my own dog, break away from her, and they discover a runaway teen close to death, hiding in the boulders along the Lake Michigan shore. VI rescues her, gets her to a hospital, forgets about her, but then the girl disappears. The hunt for her triggers a tremendous amount of interest among Chicago power brokers, both in the private healthcare delivery industry and in big developments. There are, I regret to tell people that although Chicago has many wonderful police officers, we also have quite a few who are not quite so wonderful, including the president of the Chicago Fraternal Order of Police, who's actually on administrative leave and has had 57 excessive force complaints filed against him, none of which bore fruit, but who routinely marches down Michigan Avenue carrying a MAGA flag. And so there is a cop who is one of our FOP president's followers, a man named Coney, who plays a role in this book and is kind of a hitman, hunch person for some of the more powerful figures trying to make money out of both the pandemic, out of helpless elderly people, and certainly out of property development, which is always a fun team sport in Chicago. I'm going to read a little bit from the first time we see Officer Coney when he comes to VI's house in the middle of the night. He's been at the hospital where the runaway girl, whose name nobody has so far been able to find out, where the runaway girl was being held. And it's 3 in the morning, and Mr. Contreras, the 90-something downstairs neighbor who shares VI's dogs with her, he's outside in his magenta dressing gown. And one of the good cops, Lieutenant Finchley, shows up, demands to know what's going on. And Officer Coney says, yeah, well, she was dancing around like the prom queen, refusing to tell me anything. Yeah, well, you hit her out of the blue, Mr. Contreras said. I seen you. It was like you thought you was going 10 rounds with Joe Louis, except Louis would have flattened you like the coward that you are. Is there a reason we're out on a sidewalk where everyone in Wrigleyville can hear the conversation? Lieutenant Finchley said. Remarks like yours on the record can prejudice a jury. Coney scowled at Finchley. We think Warshawski witnessed a major crime. We need to get her on ice. That is all you need to know. Sorry, we think the girl witnessed a major crime. Told you I was confused about what was going on in this book. We need to get her on ice. That is all you need to know. If you know what crime she witnessed, you must know who she is, I said. I just said that is all you need to know. Coney bit the words off like cigar ends and spat them out. He stomped down the walk. 3 officers followed him like well-trained sheep. Warshawski, Finchley said. Coney operates out of Homan Square. I wouldn't yank real hard on his chain if I were you. Homan Square. Old friends from the public defender's office had been talking about it for the last few years. It was the department's enhanced interrogation facility, they claimed. Thank you for showing up when you did, I said to Finchley. You would have tased the dogs and Mr. Contreras, maybe a bullet for me. Yeah, he wanted to muzzle me. Means I was getting under his skin. Mr. Contreras was complacent. Finchley rolled his eyes. Yeah, getting under his skin is easy. Getting out, not so much so. You're a pit dog, Warshawski. You'll go into the ring with anyone as long as they're at least 3 times your size. You and Contreras don't know how to draw a line. He was walking down the sidewalk when something occurred to him, and he came back to us. Joe Louis, Finchley said to Mr. Contreras, what century are you living in? Yeah, I seen him fight, my neighbor said. He was entertaining the troops and did exhibitions. He'd have taken that Coney fella apart like a cheap watch and crushed him. And who takes watches apart these days? Finchley said, but he was whistling under his breath as he walked to his car. Thank you.
Awesome. How has VI changed from indemnity only? It's been 1982 to 2022. I'm not talking about age. We sort of aged her sort of artfully. But what did she learn? How has she changed?
I think there are ways in which she's more melancholy than she was at the beginning. 1982, we were riding high, women, feminist women anyway. We were doing jobs that hadn't existed for us when we went to school. We were celebrating our gains in access to reproductive health. We had a woman on the Supreme Court. The year I published my first book was the first year that Chicago women could be police officers instead of just matrons in the juvie center. So we just felt like the world was open to us in ways that it has closed in on us slowly in the last 20 years. And VI's reacted to that, I suppose, as I have, by becoming more watchful, taking less for granted in terms of what's out there and what she can do. One of the big changes in the world around her has been the serious diminution of investigative journalism. It's been cut to the bone as big media companies have taken over local media outlets, both radio, TV, and also print, and made it much harder for people like VI to get their stories out and known. She has a close friend who's a journalist, Murray Ryerson. And in the early days, if she couldn't get the state's attorney to bring charges, Murray would do a story and at least highlight what was going on. That just can't happen these days, or if it does, it happens in very small fringes of the media world.
VI sort of tackles white collar crime as opposed to street crime. Was that a conscious decision on your part, or why white collar crime as opposed to, drive-bys or whatever?
This was something that Stuart Kaminsky of blessed memory was my mentor when I was first trying to write my first book, and he was very helpful to me. At that time, I was a marketing manager with a Fortune 1000, well, really Fortune 500 company, financial services company here in Chicago. And he suggested that was a good niche for me. Also, Elmer Leonard, who was one of the giants when I was first starting out, he could write books set in the docks, set in gangland, mob settings. That just is a milieu that was so alien to me. I wouldn't have been able to write, believably about it. And so I had her from the get-go in the white collar world. Also, as I kept on, I began seeing that the damage that can be done by in a large enterprise, street crime is terrible and people die and lives are damaged, but not on the scale that a big crime like, say, the Charles Keating savings and loan scandal, where he bilked 10,000 elderly people of their pensions, and many of them committed suicide. Some ended up in jail because they were shoplifting to feed themselves. And so when you start looking at the scale of damage done by white collar crime, it began to seem like a really good area to write about.
Did you ever think when you sort of started out all those years ago that you would be at book 23? I think I read an interview at one time that you said you wrote the first one just to see if you could write it. But now you're at 23, so you're kind of confident that you can do this sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm confident until I sit down to write the next sentence. And I think, I don't know what I'm doing. No, when I started, as you said, I wanted to see if I could actually write a book. As many writers, I had been writing very privately for myself, what I call my posthumous works, poems and short stories. Fortunately, no one but my dog has ever read. But I didn't know if I could write a whole novel. I wanted to create a woman detective who does what, in fact, VI does, which is to alter the image of how women act in the world, on the world stage, and in a crime novel itself, instead of being a vamp who tries to get a good boy to do bad things by using her body, or being extremely chaste and unable to tie her shoes without public supervision. I wanted a woman who was like me and my friends, who had to face life's problems and solve them, and could have a sex life without that saying she was moral or immoral, or had nothing to do with her moral character. But once I'd written the first book, and after a year, when my agent finally found a publisher for it, it's like, okay, now what? I'm still selling computers to insurance agents, and then they sold enough copies, not very many, but in 1982 enough that they wanted a second book. And the scariest thing was when I quit my day job after the third book. And I thought I still wasn't making enough money from my books to support myself, but I thought it's now or never. So I jumped off that high dive.
Cool. Well, when we come back, maybe we can give us a hint of what's next with the eye.
Thanks a lot, Tracy.
Thanks. So Amanda, no, Jane, it's going to be a problem. Jane, your book, you're going to tell us about lucid dreaming and the Burning Cove series, which is infinitely interesting. So give us an overview of the book and then maybe a little snippet of it, which would be great.
Okay. Amanda Quick, my other name right now, the one I'm under at the moment, writes romantic suspense set in 1930s California. And I would just like to emphasize that when you go into a situation like this, you have to choose whether to do a slice of gritty reality or you go for the myth, and I'm going for the myth. So this has got the glam factor, the mobsters, all the fun stuff from the movies. And I had a lot of fun with this one because the hero, Sam Sage, is my take on Sam Spade. Okay, the name is not a coincidence, let's put it that way. And the heroine has hired him to find out who is blackmailing her boss, who writes the Aunt Cornelia advice column. But the heroine is an aspiring writer who's trying to write her own novel. She's tired of doing the confession magazines. So the story takes them to Burning Cove, which is, if you know California, this is Santa Barbara, okay? This is the red roofs, the Spanish colonial look. It's just that beautiful, picturesque Hollywood version of the Mediterranean look. I told you I'm going for the myth here. And I write my plots, I write romantic suspense, but I always do it with a psychic vibe, a psychic twist, for two reasons. One, it means I don't have to learn a lot of forensic evidence and hardcore police procedural stuff, which I really don't want to have to do. And another is because it allows me, in a way, in a funny kind of way, it allows me to solve the crime in the old-fashioned Sherlock Holmes kind of way, where it's what you see, what you notice, the intuitive insights that put everything together. And that's why I go with the psychic element on these. So the book is When She Dreams, 1938 California, actually, which means that you still have people around who are recovering from the First World War, and everyone knows there's another one on the horizon. So that adds tension at either end of the story. But like Sarah was just saying, this was a time when women were actually coming out into the world. Things changed after the war, as everybody knows. But in the 30s, if it had not been for the war, the whole women's movement would have gone in a very different direction, I think. Anyhow, Sam and the heroine, Maggie, are at a party and they are watching their suspects who are moving around the room. Sam says, she wouldn't have gone to the local nightclub and had her picture taken if she hadn't wanted to be noticed. Maggie narrowed her eyes. I see what you mean. That is very good thinking. Logical. Thanks. I read The Maltese Falcon, Sam said. So did I. Enthusiasm warmed Maggie's voice. What do you think of Mr. Hammett's portrayal of the private detective? There are those in the literary world who have called that book a quintessentially American novel, an important work of modern fiction. Gertrude Stein is said to be a great fan of Hammett's mysteries. Maggie paused with an expectant air. Sam looked at her. What? He said. She smiled encouragingly. You are the first person I've met who was in a position to judge the character of Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon from an insider's point of view. You're a real private detective. What did you conclude? By now, he should have known better than to resort to wisecracks with Maggie, Sam thought. Hammett's detective is an arrogant, egotistical, narcissistic ass, he said. I'd say he has the moral code of an alley cat, but that would be unfair to cats. He isn't interested in justice. His only goal is to prove to himself and everyone else that he's the strongest, smartest guy in the room, and he doesn't care who gets hurt in the process. Maggie stared at him, her mouth open in shock. What, he said, too many big words? She blinked a couple of times, closed her mouth, and got a thoughtful expression. I knew there was something wrong with that character, she said. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was obvious he was not good hero material. Also, Sam said, he's a lousy detective. Really? Every investigator makes mistakes, but drinking a cocktail the bad guy mixes for you at a critical point in the case is not a real smart professional move. You're right, Maggie said, clearly impressed. I must tell you, however, that from a writer's point of view, sometimes one needs a plot twist.
It's just a classic 1930s interplay between the two of them, which is really fascinating.
That's what makes the era so much fun to write.
Yeah, yeah.
You could just, I'm a dialogue-driven writer in the first place, so it just really fits my voice, my writing. I would like to take a moment here as for a public service announcement. If you are reading one of my books and you come to a paragraph of description, actual narrative, I would appreciate it if you'd slow down and read it slowly because it takes a very long time to write.
I have great respect for historical writers because they have to get two things right. They have to get the writing right, but they also have to get the history right. But you're a historian, right? You history major and a librarian by trade before you sort of got this wonderful career going. So you probably enjoyed that part of it, right? Just sort of digging into the history and going down rabbit holes and finding these interesting little details. How difficult is it for you?
It's where I get my plot points. I mean, like the whole lucid dreaming thing just fell out. It was like a very big deal in the 30s. And since I am interested in the psychic vibe anyway, it was like a natural. There's just a lot of lost history in the 30s. I mean, the invention of Twinkies, for crying out loud, really, really critical stuff happened. But most of all, what I like working with in the 30s was that in spite of the fact that they'd come out of a war, and in spite of the fact they were looking at another one, and in spite of the depression that they were emerging from in 38 in California, there's an underlying sense of good old-fashioned American optimism. Science is going to show us the way. We're going to reinvent the world out here in California. And the whole West Coast had a very entrepreneurial vibe, which fits my characters. It was a place of reinvention, and all of my characters in my stories are always reinventing themselves.
You said it's a myth of history and real history. Do you have to sort of choose which one you're sort of going to highlight?
I think you have to kind of go for it in terms of voice, but I do think that fundamentally genre carries the myth, and the myth carries the core values of that era. So the myth is the story of it, but the myth is important because it is it's the history, frankly, that will be remembered 200 years from now.
Okay, good. We'll come back. We're gonna get James next. James, describe for us the Sigma Force universe. It's kind of a detailed sort of a thing. Give us an overview.
Sigma Force, they're former Special Forces soldiers that were drummed out of the service for various reasons. But because of special aptitude and skills, they're secretly recruited by DARPA, the Defense Department's Research and Development Agency. And they're retrained into various scientific disciplines so they can go out and protect the globe against various type of technological threats. So they're basically scientists with guns, for lack of a better term.
Okay. And your book?
Living by Curious.
Give us a rundown of that, and then give us a little bit of it.
So Kingdom of Bones, it's sort of a jungle epic. It takes place in the Congo. Sort of all hell breaks loose at a UN relief camp. And it's discovered that men, women, and children in the area have sunk into sort of a deep catatonic, dull-like, cattle-like state, while the environment around them is sort of ratcheted up. It's more toxic, it's more predatory, it's more dangerous. And it's up to Sigma Force to figure out, is this, whatever's going on, is it man-made? Is it something natural? And figure out what's going on. It leads to a great treasure hunt across the Congo for a mythic kingdom called the Kingdom of Bones. So I'm going to read a section here with my reading glasses, of course. That takes place very early in the novel. It takes place in that UN relief camp. And it's a dialogue between two pediatricians with they're both with Doctors Without Borders. One's a French pediatrician, the other one is an American. So Charlotte's the French pediatrician and Jameson is the American. And they're examining a young boy who's presented at their tent with these symptoms: a dull cattle-like state, doesn't seem to be responding, and they're mystified by what's going on. I don't think this boy suffers from sleeping sickness, Charlotte concluded. And initially, from the minimal pupillary response or menace reflex, I thought it might be river blindness, but I couldn't detect any parasitic worms in his eyes that cause it. Then what are you thinking? Jameson pressed her. His mother says he was fine 2 days ago. If she's right, that the onset of symptoms was too fast for any parasitic disease, protozoan or verminous. The rapidity makes me think of a viral infection. There's certainly enough of those out here. Yellow fever, dengue, Rift Valley, West Nile, not to mention the pebbling rashes on the boy and girl yesterday, all manner of pox viruses, monkeypox, smallpox. Charlotte shook her head. I don't know. The symptoms don't match any of those. We could be dealing with something novel. Most new viruses arise from disturbances of a natural landscape, digging new roads, deforestation, hunting exotic bushmeats. She glanced back to the pediatrician, also from heavy rains, especially in viruses transmitted by mosquitoes or other insects. As if summoned by the statement, a large driver ant climbed over the boy's shoulder and latched onto the child's neck. Blood dribbled as its mandibles gnashed the tender flesh. She remembered those painful bites from earlier this morning, but the boy didn't move. He never lowered the thumb from his mouth to cry out. He didn't even blink in pained startlement. He simply sat stiffly, his eyes dull. Wincing in sympathy, she reached a gloved hand and removed the ant. She pinched it hard and tossed it away. Jameson watched her, his brows bunched with concern. Pray you're wrong with it, about it being a new virus. With the overcrowding here, the displacement, the shift in populations, it could be a disaster in the making.
Excellent. It's kind of frightening. Kingdom of Bones. What's more frightening, the real life of viral thing or the stuff that you make up? I mean, I would imagine that it's scarier, the real life pathogens.
Well, I pitched this story in middle of 2019, and I had read an article about these. It was actually an article in New Scientist magazine. The title was, "When is the next global pandemic due to hit?" Fairly prophetic article. And but I wasn't interested in the pandemic nature of that article. I was more interested in the fact that it dealt with the virus hunters, these men and women that go out to the field and sample wildlife looking for the next pandemic pathogen that might threaten the globe. And I found out that a lot of these virus hunters are wildlife veterinarians, which of course plays into my role of veterinarian. So that intrigued me. And so I pitched this story to my editor about doing not necessarily a pandemic novel, because I'd done those in the past. I really wanted to do a novel about the weird biology of viruses. And so I pitched it, wrote the book, was working on the book rather. I was about 3/4 of the way through the book when March 2020 arose. And I got another call from my editor, said, "Hey, you know, those virologists that you were speaking to back in 2019, did they warn you what was going to be happening in 2020? And no, they didn't. But what they were telling me was, even more frightening, because it's weird to be, have the ear of a virologist as a global pandemic begins. It was strange to see the dichotomy between what was being said out loud in the public sphere from government agencies, from public health officials. They were saying, if you remember early on in the pandemic, they said, don't worry about wearing masks, just go about your business, save your masks for the doctors and nurses. Whereas in this year, the virologists were like, I would recommend, Jim, that you wear a biohazard level 3 biosuit before you go outdoors. So there was a sort of a disconnect between those two. So it was a challenge writing a book about viruses as a global pandemic was unfolding. It required me to keep tweaking the novel, adding COVID as an element to the story, changing some of the science because the science was changing as COVID was spreading around the globe. So it was a bit of a challenge to juggle. And I wasn't quite sure if I should even write this novel back when March 2020 happened. I was 3/4 of the way through, so there was some incentive to finish it. But my books are sort of popcorn entertainment, the big roller coaster rides of the stories. And I didn't know if writing a novel about a virus during a pandemic when people were suffering, you have doctors and nurses on the front line, you have family members that are being lost, and here I am writing a popcorn entertainment novel about a virus. I didn't know if that was inappropriate, disrespectful to these folks, but what I was hearing from the virologists, I thought was really important. They were telling me things that I wasn't hearing in the public sphere, and so a lot of the things you're going to find in this novel sort of sheds a light about the current pandemic and about what might be coming next and ways we can potentially stop that from happening again. So I decided, well, I better finish it just for that reason, besides the fact that I want to get paid.
Well, did any of that information change the story that you were writing? Did you sort of look at the reality of the situation and say, this would be interesting if we sort of pivoted a little bit and did something like that? Or
even when I turned the novel in, we were already done through copy editing. There were some changes that were occurring in the real world that were changed that made my story feel a little bit out of date. So even whether we had finished copy editings, it was going to be heading towards production. I thought, I hold the horses, that stop the presses for right now. Let me tweak this novel. Otherwise, when it comes out 6 months, 7 months from now, I don't want the novel to feel out of date already. So, I tried to write up to the deadline, try to get as much current information as I can to that story.
Good. All right, we'll come back with more questions. Chris Holm. You're up, man. You're up. Okay. Tell us a little bit about Child Zero, which is even scarier. We're talking about post-antibiotic era. That means a cut can kill you. There are no surgeries because they can't give you antibiotics. Infections are a very big risk. Frightening stuff. I mean, really frightening stuff. So thanks for keeping us up at night, but give us an overview of Child Zero and give us a little bit of it.
Sure. Child Zero is a fact-based thriller in the vein of Michael Crichton that, as you said, takes place in a world reeling from the collapse of the antibiotic era. My background is in molecular biology. This is something that scientists have been warning about for years, the imminent collapse of the antibiotic era. But I think that it's largely gone unheeded, those warnings, because the average person doesn't understand how that will ripple through society and exactly how awful a post-antibiotic era will be. So I felt that as a thriller writer and a scientist, I had a chance to really paint a vivid picture and maybe use this book as a call to action to educate people about something that is a very serious threat. But that said, it's ultimately not a pandemic thriller. It's a breakneck thriller, a chase story that takes place with a pandemic as its backdrop is kind of how I think of it. It centers on a young boy named Matt, who's the sole survivor of an attack on a shantytown in Central Park, and two NYPD detectives, Jake and Amy, who are tasked with investigating the crime. And so I thought I would read a little bit from later in the book. I didn't want to bog you guys down with too much science. I also didn't want to get too gnarly with regard to the biology. Although now I'm regretting that because James brought out the eyeball worms, and so I feel like that gives me free rein to go there. But I did not. I chose a scene from later in the book. My protagonist, Jake, NYPD detective, at this point has been captured by some mercenaries who are threatening to harm his young daughter if he does not help them get some information from a secure facility that just so happens to be on Rikers Island in the near future of my novel. Broken seashells crunched underfoot as Jake walked backlit toward the water's edge. To the west, the city's skyline glimmered against a field of purple velvet. "Took you long enough," Ringo said, materializing from the shadow of the pier. "I was beginning to think you fucked up and got pinched. Sorry to disappoint." Jake's tone was brittle, strained. If Ringo noticed, he didn't let on. "You get what we came for?" "Sure did." "Then help me put the boat back in the water so we can get out of here." "I'm afraid there's been a change of plan. I'm leaving. You're staying." "That's so?" An uncertain smile twisted Ringo's lips, like he halfway thought that Jake was putting him on. It faded when he saw the pistol in Jake's hand. "Son of a bitch. I should have realized when you gave up your piece so easily you had another on you somewhere. Yeah, you probably should have. Now sit down. Jake's voice was cold and hard, a byproduct of what Jess Vandermeer had told him, he supposed. Easy, buddy. Let's talk this through. As Ringo spoke, he showed Jake his poem, the gesture intended to pacify, but Jake wasn't fooled. He noticed that Ringo had timed it to obscure a subtle pivot that simultaneously narrowed the gap between them and presented Jake a smaller target. The only thing we're talking about is you sitting down, removing 2 of those zip ties from your belt and putting them around your hands and feet, all nice and slow. Or what? Ringo shuffled a little closer. You gonna shoot me? If I have to. Come on, man. You're not a murderer. Just put the gun down and we'll pretend this never happened, okay? Jake squeezed the grip of Amy's Glock so hard his forearm ached. His body quaked with rage and grief. The awful truth of shadow reckoning swelled like a malignancy inside his chest. Ringo, oblivious, inched nearer, palms up, arms outstretched. Please, Jake said, don't make me do this. Gibson, listen. I know you're in a tough spot right now, but I need you to be smart for both our sakes. Meaning what? I'm a working stiff man, same as you. This gig is nothing but a paycheck to me. Pike, on the other hand, is a sadistic motherfucker. If you don't do exactly as he says, he'll jump at the opportunity to go after your poor, sweet Chloe, and neither of us wants that. Is that so? I'm telling you, dude, makes me sick to even think about. Jake's jaw flexed. Zoe. Huh? My daughter's name is Zoe. Shit, Ringo smiled. You think if I hadn't botched her name, you would have bought it? Honestly, not really. Ringo shifted his weight onto the balls of his feet, like a runner getting ready to steal a base. Oh, well, can't blame a guy for trying. Ringo leapt.
Excellent. So what came to you first for Child Zeros, the science or characters?
Oh, gosh, that's an excellent question. Normally, when I write a book, I start with character. I usually have a voice nattering in my head, often a single scene in which this character is sort of experiencing the scene, and therefore I'm experiencing it through them. And I often build my books around that. I'll interrogate that individual scene to find out who this person is and why they are where they are, what they're doing. That's what happened with my Collector trilogy. That's what happened with the Michael Hendricks thrillers. Unfortunately for me, in this case, it came from the premise first. It came from the science. I really wanted to write a thriller that took place in a post-antibiotic era. The problem is, as any of the writers here, including you, I'm sure, can see, is that's a premise in need of a plot. It has no characters. I had no idea what the actual story beats would be. And so in this case, I had to take a deep, deep dive into the research because antibiotic resistance is something that's been around since the 40s. I mean, penicillin was introduced in 41. The first penicillin-resistant bacteria were seen by doctors in 42. But as our understanding has changed over the decades, that science has also changed by leaps and bounds. And so I really had to immerse myself in the research. And also, when you're dealing with anything public health, it's not just the science. You're dealing with geopolitics. You're dealing with supply chain issues. You're dealing with all sorts of things, as people have learned, seeing COVID knock the world off kilter. And so for me, it was really an issue of sort of doing a lot of wool gathering and trying to understand what the key pieces of the story were, and then fleshing out the characters from there. And what was fun for me about that was I think I ended up writing characters that I might not have otherwise written because the story demanded certain things. I think, I'm very cognizant as a straight white male of writing from a place of privilege. I'm not sure I would have tackled a character like Matt Mateo, who is a mixed race child migrant, had the story not demanded it. But I really loved that because it forced me to do my homework. It forced me to do a lot of research into people who have made the same journey he's made. And it was really eye-opening to me as a writer. And hopefully that comes across on the page.
Is there anything in the research that surprised you? I mean, there usually is. You sort of find something that you didn't expect to find. Was there something like that for this book?
Certainly there were lots of things like that. I think some of the more fanciful things in the book were there because I found them and just thought they were too delightful a detail to leave out. For example, and I apologize for going scatological on this, but as I mentioned, penicillin was actually introduced right around the Second World War. And so for the longest time, the people who were being treated with penicillin, the people who got sort of the priority were GIs. However, there was such a penicillin shortage, and so much of the penicillin they were being given was excreted, that the US Army actually started collecting the urine of our soldiers so that they could distill more penicillin from it and send it right back out to the front lines. I thought that was so bizarre and so unlikely that I had to, I have a sort of underground bazaar in the book called The Devil's Market. And I actually use a version of that story. There is a gentleman at the market selling dubious cure-alls that, as he said, are redirected directly from the fancy no-flow toilets of the ultra wealthy of New York who have access to the best drugs. Might not be everybody's idea of delightful, but as a scientist, I thought that was terrific.
So what came first for you, being a scientist or the desire to sort of write your own stuff? I mean,
oh gosh. So my entire
family,
my entire family are avid readers, but they're also very working class. In fact, not to embarrass Sarah, but my grandfather is the person who turned me on to mysteries. And one of the people that we were both giant fans of was SARA PARETSKY. He sadly has passed, but he would be so thrilled if he knew I was doing an event with her. So I always wrote stories. I always made up stories. I always told stories, but it didn't occur to me that it was something that normal people did for a living. And I suppose there's some debate as to whether normal people do it for a living, but so I had every intention of becoming a scientist. I actually, referencing James' reading, my initial goal in life was to be a bug hunter for the CDC. I wanted to be the person they dropped into Zaire when there's an outbreak of Ebola to help investigate the source and clear things up. I was serious enough about it to enter a PhD program at the University of Virginia's School of Medicine, but I decided that I just didn't have the singular focus to devote my every waking hour to that because I had too many stories nattering in my head.
I think I read somewhere that you wrote your first short story at 6, but it sort of got you sent to the principal's office, and I got to know what that story was about. I mean, what did you write that got you sent to the principal?
So the funny thing about that was this was a very positive memory for me, although I'd never been to the principal's office before. I was a good kid. I was a straight A student. The story I wrote was called The Alien Death from Outer Space. It was lavishly illustrated. I really wore down my red pen writing about these aliens trying to wipe us off the red crayon, trying to illustrate this war between aliens and humans. It was 3 pages long. It was something like, aliens came to Earth and tried to kill us. We fought back. We won. I think it was those lavish illustrations that got me the trip to the principal's office. I was invited in. He asked me a lot of questions about the story and where it came from, what my inspiration was. And I was just a kid who read way too many comic books, and watched way too many cheesy sci-fi movies. I didn't realize at the time he was trying to figure out if I was going to murder people. I just thought he was really impressed by my story. And in the end, he gave me a candy bar, a Hershey bar, and said, please don't tell anybody about this. This will be our secret. And so when I got home from school that day, I got off the bus and I walked in and I was eating a candy bar. And my mom said, where did you get that candy bar? And I said, he told me I'm not supposed to say.
Oh, no.
Which resulted in my mom calling the school.
And look at you now.
Yeah. Well, I learned if you scare the crap out of your audience, you get rewarded. And so I was off to the races after that.
Cool. Well, thank you. Well, let's just open it up to everybody now. I just want some general questions before we sort of open the floor and let the participants to sort of ask their questions. But I wanted to sort of talk about rejection because you guys are at the top of your game. You've been there a while, but it's been a process. I think for most writers, it's a process. I want to talk about what sort of kept you going when all those rejection letters and all those rejections were coming in. What motivated you to keep going? For those emerging writers in our audience who are sort of at a place where, they don't want to sort of give up, but they don't see a way forward. And now we have all of you wonderful writers here, bestsellers all, who have sort of gone through the fire, and I want to know how you did it. So let's start with Sarah.
So my favorite letter of rejection for my first book came, I think it was Simon and Schuster, but it doesn't really matter. I got rejected by 39 out of 40 publishers in New York, and the 40th accepted indemnity only. And that took a long time. But my favorite rejection letter said that a book set in Chicago had regional interest only, and that not enough people read in the Midwest to make it worth a publisher's while to publish a book set here. And yeah, I have to say that I am a petty person who likes small revenges. And I was once at a dinner party in New York with agents, editors, and so on. And one of the people there said to me, "Isn't New York wonderful? Isn't it just the best place in the world?" And I said, "Yeah, it's a great city. I forget that because I always think of it as flyover country between Chicago and Paris." And so if you ever insult me, believe me, I will take my revenge. It may not happen instantly. It may happen in a VI novel, but it will be very petty and it will be very personal.
Yeah, I second that. I think spite is a wonderful motivator. Spite is a wonderful motivator. You just
I guess I didn't know what else to do except keep going. I'm dogged more than ambitious, I guess, in a way. And once I've decided to do something, I just keep going, even if I'm running into a steel wall. That doesn't sound very bright, does it? I'll turn this over to someone who maybe has better advice.
How about you, Amanda? And Jane? Amanda Jane?
It took me 6 years to get published, so that tells you how much of an overnight success it was. And I don't know how many times during those 6 years I told myself I would quit, stop wasting my time, pursue my career. But I couldn't quit, and I guess if you can quit, you probably will. I think it's very close to an addiction, and I think it gets more intense as you do it. The more you do it, the more you want to do it. And for me, it's kind of an obsession.
James?
Yeah, Sarah got off easy. I was rejected by 49 different agents and editors. It was the 50th agent that saw something in that, some diamond in the rough. And I'll share my favorite rejection letter. And I've shared this before at book talks. Usually you get the form rejection letter. It's impersonal. "Dear sir, ma'am, we hate your book. Don't submit to us again, editor." So I got that form rejection letter from an editor. And they took that extra special time to write me a little note on the back, expecting a little pat on the back. "We like this one character. Too bad the rest of your novel sucks." But it was just 3 words. The 3 words were, "This is unpublishable." So you have to respect that they, took the extra time besides just rejecting me to kick me in the nuts besides. So kudos to that editor. But, I just kept sending it out there. And I think it's more just persistence more than anything. We're just stubborn. I just wasn't going to take for an answer and kept sending it out there. So I got a call at 6 o'clock in the morning because apparently everybody in New York doesn't know the West Coast is 3 hours earlier. And I was still working as a veterinarian, obviously. So I thought it was my emergency clinic calling me. So I was a little grumpy, thinking, I have to go in the clinic early. And she says, "Oh, I read your synopsis in your novel, and I really think I could represent it." And my first response was, "Good luck, lady," because I had personal recommendation from an editor that this is unpublishable. So I literally, my concept going with my editor was, she'll never succeed. So that was probably not the best attitude at that point, but she did find a home for it. So good for her.
Mary Higgins Clark, I heard her once in a talk. She bore a grudge way more than I did. She kept a list of who had rejected her, and if they asked her for a favor when she was Mary Higgins Clark, she was like, nope, chance.
I have met that editor who said that this is unpublishable. I knew him because he was in the sci-fi fantasy world. So I saw him at a Worldcon, and told him, oh, you rejected me. This is unpublishable. Of course, I didn't remember, but I just.
Well, and just for the people at
back like Sarah did.
Just for the people at home, James, what's the ballpark number of novels that you've sold, like worldwide?
I'm writing my 40th novel right now. So
no. I mean in terms of sales.
Oh, I don't know.
Like, we're talking millions upon millions. I just wanted to point that out, since unpublishable is pretty harsh judgment for somebody who sold millions of copies in 40 languages. That's it's fascinating.
Screw him.
I can say in my case, there's something. So I've had 2 agents in my career. One of them worth a damn, and I got both of them by blind queries. And when I was starting out, I heard from a lot of people that a bad agent is worse than no agent at all. And I didn't understand what that meant. I left at the first agent who offered me representation. I think I queried something like 90 agents before I got a couple of offers. And it was a poor fit. And I should have known it was a poor fit, because the communication was bad even during the courtship period. And if there are red flags during the courtship, things aren't going to get better once you're married. Is really how I look at it. But I would say spite and hubris are really the ways that I kind of kept going. I was lucky enough to make the leap from a small press to Mulholland Books with The Killing Kind, which was a couple of novels ago for me, and it also ended up winning the Anthony Award for Best Novel. My first agent, had pushed me to write that book because of a short story I'd written that ended up in the Best American Mystery Stories. She wanted me to expand that to a novel. So I did, and I sent it to her, and she promptly sat on it for 7 months and then got back to me to say, this novel is unpublishable. I disagreed. We parted ways. I think I won that argument ultimately. But yeah, I think you just have to have a bedrock belief in your own stories, that someone besides you wants them. Hopefully you want to read your own stories. I think that's why we all sit down to write them. You just have to have faith that there's someone out there who wants to read them. But you also have to balance that with a dose of realism and a willingness to take criticism. And that's the real trick, I think.
I remember I went to the Maui Writers Conference. It was my first writers conference. If you're going to go to a writers conference, go to the Maui Writers Conference. And Nicholas Sparks was one of the headliners for the event. And so he gave a speech about his success and how he, had The Notebook published. And he was saying, he sent it out and he got a prompt, almost immediate acceptance from an agent. And I thought, well, I will just wait to see what everybody else says. And then everybody else came back with a no. So he returned to that agent, thought, well, I'm going to interview this agent because of the concern about a bad agent being a problem. So he found out that the agent wasn't actually who he had submitted the novel to. That agent had died. And it was a sub-agent who was sort of taken over and was sort of trying to get, the business back up and running. So his questions for her was like, how many novels have you sold? 0. What's your client list like? How many clients do you represent? 0. So that he said, I thought for a while, I thought, okay, you're my agent. so you never know. That worked out very well for Nicholas.
Story after millions of rejections actually was Tom Clancy, who was rejected. I don't even know by how many publishers, but he had served under Jim Webb, who was then Reagan's Secretary of the Navy in Vietnam. And after every publisher in New York had rejected him, he sent it to Jim Webb, who sent it to the Annapolis press, and because they were Navy men, the Navy press agreed to print it, and they published 400 copies. And then Webb gave one to Reagan, and it just happened to be that it was on the desk in the Oval Office the day that Fortune magazine came to do a photo shoot of a day in the life of the president. So every would-be CEO in America saw Hunt for Red October on Reagan's desk, and suddenly there was such a demand for this book, and the Navy press was not equipped to print hundreds of thousands of copies. So they quickly did a deal with Ballantine, who took over the book. So I guess, and so Tom Clancy's advice to everyone in the room was basically make sure that you have a friend who can get your book onto the president's desk at a critical moment.
Simple.
So the bottom line is, if you can sort of be turned around from writing, it's probably not the profession for you. You have to be sort of pig-headed and stick to it and be sort of, spiteful. Long story short. So what are you guys working on now? This book is in the can. It's out in the world now. James, what are you working on?
This is the first book of the fantasy series, so I'm just finishing up the second book, Cradle of Ice. And then I am just now putting the opening chapters to the next Sigma novel. Don't have a title for it yet, but it takes place in Australia. It deals with a sort of the history of colonial Australia. It deals with the ocean economy, and it deals basically a great treasure hunt around the world for an artifact that might prove that we're not alone in the universe.
Ooh.
Ooh, scary. Jane?
Well, this is where the name problem becomes an issue. I actually write under 3 names. So the third one is Jane Castle, which happens to be my birth name, but I managed to sign that away early on in my career and took 10 years to get it back. Yeah. But under the Jane Castle name, I'm now doing futuristic romantic suspense. So the next one out will be Sweetwater and the Witch. And for those who read the series, the Harmony series, yes, it's another Dust Bunny book. And if you don't read the Harmony series, don't worry about it. You don't want to know.
Sarah?
I grew up in rural, that's such a hard word to say, rural Kansas, even though Chicago's been my home for 50 years. But for some reason, in the last 5 or 6 years, that landscape and those people have been drawing me back. And so I've just started work on a book that's once again set in eastern Kansas and has a backstory that goes back to the Bleeding Kansas days, which I'm also somewhat obsessed by.
Okay. And Chris?
So a couple of years ago, I had this really odd opportunity. I was contacted by a film producer who wanted to pitch something to HBO and asked me to work with him on it, based on an NSA symposium that he was a part of. And so I pitched this mini series to HBO about a quantum computing arms race in the near future between not just superpowers, but also independent actors. And unfortunately, I mean, we had some good talks, didn't go anywhere, but I had this idea kicking around for a while, and I've been really interested in tackling that. However, I have been forbidden from my wife to write that because I wrote about a pandemic and then a pandemic happened. So I'm juggling between that, and I have a sort of 1980s period story that I kind of consider my Amblin Entertainment Kids on Bikes sort of story that involves alien abduction myth. That is the other thing I'm kind of considering. And that has the added benefit of, if I'm writing a period piece about a bunch of teenage boys in the 80s, I don't have to worry about COVID, which is handy as a writer.
Okay, good. All right, wonderful. Well, let's open it up for questions from our audience and see if anybody has anything interesting to ask you guys.
We do have a question from Ginny Rudd, who wants to know, did any of you make any major changes because of rejections?
I mean, I fired an agent.
So did I.
But in your work, I mean, like if
No,
somebody,
I know.
the aliens didn't seem real enough, did you go back and work on them some more?
Well, did you start with a premise and, you know, this is unpublishable and go, okay, maybe that won't work, and just started a whole new like genre or anything major change, or did you stick with your original as much as you could out of spite, I guess?
Well, I can again, after 50, it took a while to get 50 rejections, by the way. It's not an immediate process. And so I thought, well, maybe I'm not a thriller writer. So I did jump to a different genre. I started writing a fantasy novel. And I was about 3/4 of the way through that fantasy novel when I got that call, that 50th call, that agent who called me at 6 o'clock in the morning. And the question that all the agents ask you at some point is, what are you working on next? And I said, well, I'm working on a fantasy novel. And she goes, ugh, writing that. I don't like fantasy. I don't know any of the fantasy editors. You know, stop that. Give me another thriller. Of course, me being unpublished, this is my 50th, person that finally showed some interest. I said, of course, I'll do that, which is an outright lie, because like back in my mind, I'm still thinking this is unpublishable when it comes to my thriller. So I thought I'm just going to finish this fantasy. And so I did. I submitted it to a contest for my writers conference I just mentioned. I went to that conference, ended up selling that fantasy book at that conference. And, I called my agent and said, hey, I think I sold my fantasy series. They offered me, Del Rey Books offered me a 3-book deal. Would you do the contracts for me to make sure I don't get screwed over? And she's like, sure, I love fantasy. About 15% engender great love. And she's, oh, by the way, we have 2 houses bidding on Subterranean, your thriller. And so all of a sudden I went from unpublished to 2 different publishing houses, 2 different genres, 2 different pen names. So similar to Jane / Amanda, I was James Clemens / James Rollins / James Chakowski, the veterinarian. No one liked my real last name. I don't think Jane Castle at least made a resurgence. James Chakowski never will. It's Polish. He uses every letter of the alphabet. I'm a good Chicago boy myself. And that they said, we like your novel, but that name's got to go. We need to we can't have somebody walk into Barnes and Noble and say, I'm looking for that book by that Polish guy, and hope for the best. So it was confusing for a while.
Thank you.
I don't think that we have any more questions. I could come up with questions, but I know we're running late on time. So
I could ask questions. Seriously. This is for James Rollins. Since your books are ensemble, do you have a favorite character?
Ooh.
Favorite character. Yeah, that's it. It sounds like, what's your favorite kid type of question. But
I know, but you have.
Kowalski's sort of the comic relief for the Sigma Force universe. He's a bit of a dumb lug. It doesn't really belong in Sigma Force. He's not this cutting edge, sharp scientist with guns. But I created him in Ice Hunt, which was a book that I written like 4 or 5 years prior to the Sigma Force universe. But I liked him so much, I recruited him to Sigma, even though it didn't belong. But also in this book, I have Tucker and Kane, their military war dog. An Army Ranger and his military war dog that's featured in this book that I like writing from Kane's point of view, the dog's point of view. That's my veterinary background. Nothing like writing from a dog's point of view. And don't worry, they don't break out into song halfway through like a Disney dog does. I try to make it authentic as I can.
Thank you.
okay, we do have a couple of others that came in the chat. I don't know how much time we have, but Betty Perry wants to know who your favorite authors are. And Gwen Martin wants to know if any of you feel that landscape affects character, like rural or urban landscape, and how that affects character. So whatever you want to answer.
I would just like to take a minute to rave about The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. This is like a total reinvention or upgrade or whatever you want to call it. This is the modern Goth. This is the perfect modern Gothic. Highly recommended.
I've just started that novel too, The Hacienda. Barbara Peters sent me a copy. Said, you need to read this. And I do whatever Barbara Peters says. So
I got it the same way. From Barbara Peters.
So I I just read a novel that's a little off the beaten track called The Dictionary of Lost Words, which I thought was gripping and brilliant, set in the Oxford English Dictionary, in the world of the Oxford English Dictionary, creating the dictionary. And the writing is beautiful. The woman who wrote it, Pip Williams, her name is, immersed herself in the OED archives and brought that world to life. The lost words are the vernacular that were not included in the dictionary because they were spoken by illiterate people. And so she imagines a character who's rescuing the language of the illiterate. Ultimately, the words that her fictional character created decades later did make it into the OED, but it was quite an uphill battle.
I had a question from Betty Perry. Wants to know who your favorite authors are. It's an interesting one.
My favorite author is the person I'm reading right now, so I'm going to duck that one.
Yeah.
I mean, I obviously being, science background, Michael Crichton was a big influence. I had Jurassic Park on my shelf when I was writing that first book, Subterranean, because I'd never written a novel before, so I didn't know how to pace a novel. So I used Jurassic Park as a template. I thought, well, when does Michael Crichton introduce the first dinosaur? Well, that's when you're going to see the first creature in my book. What page does he kill off a character in the first time? Well, how many pages am I? Oh, I did kill off a character right here because that's what Michael Crichton did. So again, huge influence.
That's fascinating because I did the same thing I had Chandler and Robert Parker open on my lap while I was writing my first book by hand. Mind you, we're talking 1978, 9 when I started writing. And it's comforting to me to know that someone else did that. Oh, a third of the way through, someone beats up the hero. So VI gets beaten up a third of the way through the book.
Why reinvent the wheel? It's already out there.
I've always thought that this, no matter how many creative writing classes you take, ultimately writing is a self-taught business.
Yeah, and for me, again, obviously, especially for Child Zero, Crichton was a huge influence. I grew up reading his thrillers. As a nerdy kid, they just spoke to me because his main characters were frequently scientists. They were very science-driven. I mean, the Andromeda Strain for me was life-changing. In terms of, I'm a huge Chandler and Hammett fan, Patricia Highsmith as well. In terms of modern authors, I think Megan Abbott is writing some of the best crime fiction on the planet. And she's one of my auto buys no matter what. I would also say Susanna Clark, who is easy to be a completist on because she's a fantasy writer who's only written 2 novels and a collection of short stories. And yet everything she has ever put out has been magnificent. Her most recent Piranesi came out, I guess, a couple of years ago now, and is an absolutely marvelous starting point if you've never checked her out.
Oh, thanks. I'll look for her. I agree with you about Megan. I have to say I'm incredibly jealous of how she writes.
Yeah, there are 2 kinds of writers I think that I admire. There's the people who do stuff that I do, but do it better. And then there are the people who do something that I can never, ever do. And Megan is the sort that I can't do what she does. I have no access to the interiority of what it's like to be a teenage girl in America. And that's probably for the best. But, I always feel like I'm being let in on a secret when I read a Megan Abbott novel.
We've got a question from Sydney Hillary. How do you develop an idea for a novel? I guess that goes to sort of how many of you outline who are pantsers among you?
I really hate the word pantser. It sounds like a tank division about to try to invade Russia. A chess player. I'm not a chess player. I can't think 10 moves ahead. My characters go in motion and I realize that my story line was wrong. And so I have to throw it out and go back to the beginning. So I think of myself as a tennis player reacting to the incoming ball.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of both. I being that my stories are very plot driven, they're big roller coasters. I have to be able to build that roller coaster, at least the fundamental skeletal outline. I'll know the beginning, I'll know the end, so I know where that roller coaster ride has to end. And then I'll know a couple of the twists and turns and drops There's the tent poles that are going to hold up the story, but I don't know much more than that. To me, the joy of writing is the discovery between those tent poles, is where the story changes, how it twists. I've tried outlining before, but I found two things. If I outline too great detail, then I know the story too well and it bores me. I don't want to write it.
Mm-hmm.
And then B, I sort of chafe against the restrictions of having to stick to that outline. My editor, of course, has realized that when I used to have to sell my books based on synopses, where they'd want 20-page single-space descriptions of the story, I would submit it. They would pay me. I'd go home and write something totally different, turn that in. It's nothing like the outline you submitted. And I said, well, do you like it? Yeah, and then shut up. So now I don't bother with that anymore.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I try to start with something. I try to start with an outline, or at least something that looks legit, and it just always changes under me as soon as I start.
In my case, I always know the opening scene and the closing scene. They rarely change. I have a vague sense of either some major tentpole scenes or sometimes just set pieces, an idea for a cool place to set an action set piece, for example. And yeah, I like to write to fill in the gaps. I write to entertain myself. I write to sort of put my own obsessions and interests on the page.
Okay, we have a question for James and Chris. They want to know how long typically you spend on research to sort of flush your books out. How long do you take for you?
It's a trap for me because I do like to do the research to the point of not getting writing done. So once upon a time, I kept researching and realizing there's no pages being produced. So now I strictly restrict myself. I'm allowed to do 90 days of research. Then whether I'm done or not, I have to start putting words on paper. So I'll do my bulk of my research before I begin the novel. But then, of course, as anybody knows, as you're writing a novel, every page needs something you have to double check. Where's the Starbucks? In downtown Manhattan. What because if you get it wrong, you're gonna get that 1-star Amazon review. Saying this was wrong.
Yeah, and in my case, I've sort of. This is going to sound a lot more efficient than it actually is, but I tend to research as I go quite a bit. I'm a slow writer, but I like to research as I go because it prevents me from going too deep down a rabbit hole. If I were just to do the research, I would never come out of that. That's what's fun for me. So when I'm writing a scene, I like to research that scene. I'll often have Google Maps and a bunch of other things open in the background that I'm constantly referencing. And for me, that's a lot of fun. I have a lot of friends who came from journalism and they love to put the TK in there, say, like details to come. I actually don't like doing that because I find that the research often drives where the scene is going to go. And I don't want to miss out on something because I went with the first most obvious idea in my head and kind of left something on the table because of it, which might explain why Child Zero took me 4 years to get a draft of. That was the longest it's ever taken me to write a draft of a book. And there were other factors as well, but research was a big one.
Okay, and I think we have one final question. What advice would you give to aspiring writer who has 1,000 stories stuck in his mind, but just can't somehow get started? That's a big one.
So I have a really practical bit of advice that I found helpful when I was starting, and that is set aside whatever you think the opening of the story is, chapter 1, sentence 1, that big punch that drags you in. Give yourself permission to not start there. Start elsewhere in the story. Start with whatever scene is speaking to you and just get it down. Because I find sometimes I'm very daunted by that perfect first sentence, that perfect first page. And if I skip past that and think, I'll fix it in post, that's sometimes enough to get the ball rolling. But you really do need to finish, especially as an unpublished author, because you can write the greatest opening chapter in the history of the world, and it's very unlikely that you'll get a book deal on that alone.
Yeah, I just have a little post-it note right here. It says, today I give myself permission to write crap.
Yes.
Because it's just this internal editor where you think, oh gosh, this scene is really important. It's got to be perfect. It's an important pivotal scene. And then, I will be daunted if I don't want to write this. It's so critical to the story and it's so pivotal. I'm tempted to stop right there, but I just said, no, I'm just going to plow through it and I'll deal with in post, like you said, I'll try to fix it then if I have to, but usually it ends up being fine, but just that internal editor keeps you daunted from being able to write.
I would just say, start at a point that excites you.
Mm-hmm.
If you have 1,000 stories and you're not starting any of them, you're using your 1,000 stories as a way to keep from writing. So you're saying, oh, this one, I could do this one, but it might not be any good. I could do this one, but it might not be any good. So you have to pick one, whether it's good or not. Well, you don't know if it'll be good or not. I think you need to go back to James's advice. Pick one. Maybe it's crap, but you won't know until you've written something. And as my friend Liza Cody, great underappreciated British writer, says, when she's finished a book, maybe it's crap, but at least it's finished crap. Never going to get to that finished crap if you don't start with picking one of those 1,000 stories.
Well, I think that's it. No more questions, I don't think. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. Jane, Chris, James, and Sarah, thank you so much. The next Rogue Reads will be next month, and I hope you all will come back and join us then. And hopefully the 4 of you will be lucky enough to sort of win our giveaway. So stay posted for that, and we'll let you know. So have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
happy
Tracy.
writing.
Thank you, all the Rogue Red Writers.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Yeah, great fun.
Take care, everybody.